Hello, good evening and welcome. Thank you for your generosity. I'm delighted to see so many people here this evening for the annual Billington Lecture in the History of the American West. My name is Steve Hindle. I'm Director of Research here. I look after the Huntington's Research Fellowship Program, its conference program, and its lecture program, and I am eternally grateful for the consistent support that so many of you show for our programs. I'm delighted to introduce this evening Professor John Mack, better known as Johnny Faragher, who's accepted to give this year's Ray Allen Billington Lecture in the History of the American West. This is one of the Huntington's endowed lectures created by a gift a number of years ago in honor of Ray Allen Billington, former senior research associate at the Huntington, with the intention that the speaker should always address some aspect of the history of the American West or the borderlands. The first lecture was delivered by my predecessor as Director of Research, Martin Ridge, and his successors have included many distinguished historians, including Elliot West, Richard White, Louis Warren, Anne Hyde, Ari Kelman, and indeed, on one previous occasion, Johnny Mack Faragher himself. John is Howard R. Lamar Professor of History and American Studies Emeritus at Yale University, having recently retired from the History Department, where he taught the history of the American West and Native American history for over 20 years. He holds his BA from UC Riverside and his PhD from Yale, and taught for 15 years at Mount Holyoke College before returning to Yale in 1993. He's the author of Women and Men on the Overland Trail, 1979, Sugar Creek, Life on the Illinois Prairie, which was published in 1986, Daniel Boone, The Life and Legend of an American Pioneer, 1992, and A Great and Noble Scheme, the tragic story of the expulsion of the French Acadians from their American homeland in 2005, and co-author of two hugely important contributions that have effectively communicated the history of the American West to a wider audience. The American West, A New Interpretive History, 2000, and Frontiers, A Short History of the American West, in 2007. His most recent book is Eternity Street, Violence and Justice in Frontier Los Angeles, which appeared last year with Norton and is due to appear in paperback later this month. However, the Huntington bookstore has cunningly arranged for large numbers of the paperback copy of this volume to be on sale this evening, and Johnny would be delighted to sign a copy of Eternity Street were you willing to purchase one first. The title of his Billington Lecture this evening is, as you can see, The Theatre of Many Deeds of Blood, The Geography of Violence in Frontier Los Angeles. Please welcome Professor Johnny Faragher.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. It's really good to be back at the Huntington. As you may be able to tell, I'm fighting a cold and getting over it, so please excuse me in advance if I have a few coughs here. Frontier Los Angeles was one of the most violent places in the 19th century American West. Indeed, it may have been one of the most violent places in all of American history. That pattern of violence commenced with the Spanish conquest. It continued under Mexican jurisdiction and grew even more intense during the first generation of United States rule. What accounts for such a level of violence? In my book, Eternity Street, I argue that social and cultural forces were at work. First, a structure of violence. Frontier Los Angeles was fashioned not once, but twice by conquest and military occupation. The conquering Spaniards imposed a system of forced labor on indigenous residents, a system that relied on violence to discipline workers and increase production on missions and ranchos. That system remained in place following the secularization or privatization of the missions and the emancipation of the mission Indians in the 1830s. And it continued after the American conquest in the 1840s. But Anglos also arrogantly trumpeted their superiority over Californios, treating them with prejudice and alienating much of the Spanish-speaking population, a majority well into the 1870s in Los Angeles, and creating the conditions for generations of continuing conflict. At the same time, effective law enforcement and feeble institutions of justice on the periphery of the nation-state, both of the Republic of Mexico and the United States of America, meant that perceived injustice in Los Angeles often resulted in fisticuffs and feuds, in vendettas and vigilantism. The structure of violence was nurtured, reinforced, and perpetuated by a culture of violence. In the absence of state authority, social order was more often a function of honor than of law, and honor frequently amounted to little more than one man's capacity to dominate another. For Latinos and Anglos alike, the bedrock of honor culture was a man's control of his household. In the public world, he might be subject to the will of more powerful men, but at home, he alone was dominant, a position he might well enforce with violence. Intimate violence, in turn, was central to the reproduction of violence. A home could be a refuge from the world, but it could also be a hothouse of rage and tumult, an incubator of the virus of violent behavior that infected the public world. Well, in a nutshell, that's the argument that supports the narrative of my book. And I've spoken about that in some detail in talks here in the Los Angeles area previously. So this evening, I want to venture into aspects of that history that didn't make it into the book. Researching and writing Eternity Street was one of the greatest pleasures of my career as a historian. In part, that's because Southern California is my homeland, the place I grew up, was educated, and where most of my large family continues to reside. But also a pleasure because of the unexpected richness of the historical archive, largely thanks to the collections here at the Huntington. I'll always treasure the many hundreds of hours. I've written hundreds of hours here. I actually calculated it this afternoon. It's more like thousands of hours I spent in the reading room poring over old court cases and other records. And here's a shout out as well to the Seaver Center for Western History at the Natural History Museum in Exposition Park, a shockingly underfunded institution that is vital to the practice of Southern California history. The past that I relate in Eternity Street took place here. And visiting these places and digging up their visual history was also great fun for me. It still is. And so I also want to use this opportunity this evening to share with you a variety of images, many of them from the photographic and cartographic collections here at the Huntington. I hope some of what I show and tell this evening will be new and interesting to you. My study of Los Angeles focuses on the period extending from 1830, when California was under Mexican jurisdiction, to 1875, the 30th year of American rule. And I'll use two images to represent that breadth of time, both of the Los Angeles Plaza. Here's the first, a lithograph by Charles Koppel, an artist attached to the Pacific Railroad Survey that mapped out several potential routes for a transcontinental rail line in the early 1850s. Koppel gives us the view east from atop Fort Moore Hill, immediately west of the plaza, which in those days was at least twice as high as it is today. To orient yourself, the Ramon C. Cortines School of Visual and Performing Arts sits atop what remains of Fort Moore Hill in downtown LA. Looking down from the hill, we see the church. From the backside, and other adobe structures surrounding the open space of the plaza. Koppel captures the sparse look that by all accounts characterized the Pueblo during the Mexican years and well into the 1860s. The second image is a photograph taken 23 years later, with the camera positioned at almost the same location on Fort Moore Hill. A comparison provides a sense of the change in the urban landscape over those years. Most obviously, the construction of Pico House, which opened as a first-class hotel in 1870, but also the exterior remodel of the church, the landscaping of the plaza, and in general, the higher density of building. These two images bracket the period I researched and wrote about. The foundation of that history is my enumeration of all the homicides region between 1830 and 1875, as recorded in historical sources. Using government records, newspapers, letters, diaries, and other primary sources, I found documentation for 468 homicides over those 45 years. Here's a screenshot of several entries in that database. 468 murders is a lot of violent death for a region that numbered fewer than 2,000 residents in 1830. And no more than 20,000 residents in 1875. It's a lot of violent death, but it's not all of it. Additional murders may have occurred in obscure locations and gone unreported, perhaps undiscovered. Fallible researchers like myself may have missed some that were recorded, or the record of a particular crime may have gone missing. There's a standard statistical test, a procedure known as capture-recapture, designed to estimate what statisticians call the dark number, the actual total that will never be known. The test results estimate that my homicide database includes, for the entire period, 79% of all the murders committed in Los Angeles County. Assuming that estimate is correct, the actual number of murders in greater Los Angeles over the period would be closer to 600. So as you consider the numbers in tonight's talk, keep in mind, they are an undercount. 600 murders, or even 468, over 4.5 decades is a lot of death, a lot of dying for a regional community with fewer residents than the city of San Marino has today. Just imagine. But to really compare the lethal record of Los Angeles with other places and other times, we need a comparative measure, and that's the value of the homicide rate, a measure of the frequency of violent death for a standard population size, conventionally calculated as the number of violent deaths per 100,000 residents. So here are the rates for frontier Los Angeles based on that 468 number. The first column covers the years of Mexican jurisdiction, the second, the early American period, the third, by which time there began to be some control from the end of the Civil War to 1875. To put these numbers in perspective, consider that the homicide rate for 2015, the most recent available year for the United States, was 5 per 100,000. 11 per 100,000 for the 100 largest American cities. 21 per 100,000 for the 7 American cities reporting the greatest increase in the frequency of murder in 2015. Obviously, those numbers pale in comparison with these. Homicide was very high during the Mexican period. Many of the missing homicides, by the way, come here. So this number probably should be much higher because there was no newspaper reporting crime, and the public records were poorly kept and poorly preserved. Los Angeles had a reputation for violence among both Mexican officials and Californios. But with the American conquest, the situation got considerably worse. The murder rate in LA County was 50 times higher in the 1850s than it was in New York City. A homicide rate of 200 or more is the equivalent of low-level warfare, comparable to the violence that took place in Mexican cities at the height of the wars between the drug cartels. It characterizes a world in which violent behavior is commonplace, one in which virtually every family and every household is eventually visited by lethal violence in some way. Moreover, criminologists have demonstrated a strong positive correlation between the homicide rate and the frequency of less lethal forms of violence, because crimes like assault and rape are frequently underreported compared to murder. It's difficult to hide or ignore murder. The violence of a society is best tracked by the pattern of homicides. When we see numbers like these for Los Angeles County, we ought to think of them as indicative of all sorts of violent behavior. The more murder, the more attempted murder, the more assault, the more street and saloon brawls, the more rape, the more intimate violence. The homicide rate, in other words, is the best index we have for measuring the generalized violence of a society. The record of murder in frontier Los Angeles runs the gamut, from brief press items noting the discovery of an unidentified body to nearly complete court files including the names of victims, perpetrators, witnesses, depositions, and testimony, as well as the disposition of the case. The information included in the database, again, you see a page of it here, provides plenty of angles to investigate. And by the way, I've uploaded this database to the website of the Criminal Justice Research Center at The Ohio State University, where it's freely available to other researchers and historians. One piece of information that is known specifically for 405 of the 468 cases is the general location of the crime. That provides us with the means to examine the geography of homicide in Los Angeles. So here it is. I've used a base map from the 19th century before there was a whole lot of development. So here you see, within the corporate limits of Los Angeles, 60% of all the murders took place. In the San Gabriel Valley, another 20%. And then smaller percentages here in the San Fernando Valley and the Tehachapis, the South County, and the lower Santa Ana River. Clearly, the place to begin is the Pueblo itself. Here's the first map of the city, surveyed and drawn in 1849. Let's realign this to the cardinal points of the compass and zoom in on the area surrounding the plaza. The plaza is at the center, right there. There's the church. There's Fort Moore Hill. This is where we were looking from Fort Moore Hill down onto the plaza. The Vineyard District. Los Angeles was a big vinicultural center, growing a lot of wine, making a lot of brandy. So-called Sonora Town, principally Latino district on the north side. Now what we think of as downtown's Chinatown. Here are the Elysian Hills, Elysian Park, and downtown. Here, Bunker Hill, hedging downtown. Here's Main Street. Again, the plaza, Main Street running through it, the church. At the southeast corner here, the plaza connects with a little stretch of street known as Calle de los Negros, which Anglos called Negro Alley. Taken together, Negro Alley and the plaza was the most lethal location in the entire Los Angeles region. This area, the center circle in the slide, no more than 5 or 6 areas in extent, accounted for 20% of all the homicides in the greater Los Angeles region from 1830 to 1875. This photograph, taken from the second floor of a building on the southeast corner of Commercial and Los Angeles streets, looks toward the building known as the Coronel Adobe. Here, we'll see that again in a minute. With Negro Alley extending to the north. It was taken by photographer William Godfrey, who owned the Sunbeam Photographic Gallery. Note the title, which I believe is Godfrey's title, Scene of the Chinese Riot. In the mid-1860s, the first Chinese immigrants began arriving in Los Angeles. Negro Alley became the principal center of their Chinatown. That was because the Chinese were kept out of all other neighborhoods. In 1871, Negro Alley and the Coronel Adobe were the site of an infamous riot and mass lynching which took the lives of 18 Chinese men. In my book, I argue that this event was the culmination of the outlawed justice that prevailed in frontier Los Angeles in the absence of state-sponsored justice. But Negro Alley was infamous long before the Chinese massacre. This photo, taken a few years later than the photo we just saw in 1882, from a balcony on the southeast corner of Aliso and Los Angeles streets, offers a better view. You can see here the backside of the fire department building, which still stands on the plaza, and the little corner of the Pico House Hotel right here. Calle de los Negros became the principal vice district of Los Angeles during the 1830s, with the secularization of the missions, the emancipation of the Mission Indians, and the expansion of viniculture in the Pueblo. Emancipados, or liberated Mission Indians, made up the overwhelming majority of workers in the extensive Vineyard District on the town's east side. And on Saturday evenings, to celebrate the end of their six-day work week, large crowds of workers clustered along this short stretch of street, fueled by cheap wine and rot gut brandy. Their raucous partying continued through the night and into the next morning. Public drunkenness led to brawling that often turned lethal. During the American period, many saloons, gambling houses, and brothels opened along the 500-foot stretch of Negro Alley, and it became even more murderous. That interesting locality known as Nigger Alley, reported the Star in January 1853, was last Sunday the scene of another of those anatomical dissections for which it has become famous. Here again, the Coronel Adobe, the cornerstone of Negro Alley, in another Godfrey photo of 1871. The sprawling adobe was constructed as a townhouse for the Coronel family, who immigrated to Los Angeles from Mexico in the 1830s. Antonio Coronel, who served a term as mayor of Los Angeles in the 1850s, taught the Pueblo's first subscription school in the front room. Later, that room was converted into a saloon and a gambling house under a variety of names, and it was the site of numerous lethal encounters over the years. In 1851, in front of the Coronel, County Sheriff James Barton proved his mettle in a memorable July 4th shootout with gamblers. In 1854, in the corner room, 3 Americans drew and fired their revolvers in a wild exchange that killed 1 and wounded 4 bystanders. In 1863, in the corral behind the building, an American shot and killed a California musician, putting a brutal end to their competition over the love of a prostitute. And in 1871, in the front room, Dr. Tong Chi Long, a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine, was dragged into the street, shot in the face, and lynched. Disorder along Negro Alley often spilled over onto the plaza just around the corner. You can see the proximity from this sketch map, which I found in a transcript of a court case resulting from the Chinese massacre. So here, Negro Alley, the Coronel Adobe, and the plaza. Church would be right here. During the 1850s and 60s, The homes of elite Californios surrounding the plaza were converted into yet more saloons, gambling houses, and brothels, encouraging the spread of the anarchy onto the public and civic space laid out in front of the Catholic Church on the west side of the plaza. And here's the plaza again, another Godfrey photograph taken like the first images we saw from the summit of Fort Moore Hill. Into the late 1860s, Indians continued to cluster along Negro Alley on Saturday night and Sunday, but the patrons of the bars, Monte tables, and cribs were drawn from all the ethnic groups in Los Angeles. Many men, Americans and Mexicans alike, passed through the pueblo on their way to or from the mines in the north, and they included plenty of riffraff. Horace Bell's description in his classic Reminiscences of a Ranger from 1881, the first real book published in Los Angeles, Bell's uproarious first-hand history of frontier LA, is right on the money. Bell wrote, "Negro Alley was the most perfect and full-grown pandemonium that this writer has ever beheld. Americans, Spaniards, Indians, foreigners rushing and crowding along. Every few minutes a rush and maybe a pistol shot would be heard, and when the confusion incident to the rush would have somewhat subsided and inquiry made, you would learn that, oh, it was only a knife fight between two Mexicans, or a gambler had caught someone cheating and had perforated him with a bullet." The homicide statistics reflect the diversity that Bell reported. 45% of the murder victims of Negro Alley and the Plaza were Latino, 40% were Anglo, 15% were Indian. Those proportions echo the ethnic composition of the pueblo. This graph compares the percentage of the population and the percentage of perpetrators and victims of each of the four main groups in frontier Los Angeles, generalized over the entire period. During the quarter century, 1850 to 1875, Anglos, broadly defined, and Latinos, that is Californios and Mexicans, made up 44% and 45%, respectively, of the county's population. Indians around 10%, and Chinese less than 1%. Looking at the perpetrators for murder for that same period, 1850 to 1875, 47% were Anglo, 39% were Latino, and 13% were Indian, 1% Chinese. Of the murder victims, 33% Anglo, 41% Latino, 20% Indian, 5% Chinese. Let's generalize. Numbers can get daunting. Anglos killed more and died less than Latinos. Indians and Chinese suffered disproportionate to their share of the population. So, 44% of the population, 47% of the perpetrators, 33% of the victims, correspondingly. Indians, it's true, committed more murders proportionally than other groups. But Indians struck out almost exclusively at other Indians, as you can see here. This is a chart that looks at the ethnicity of the victims of perpetrators. So, of Anglo perpetrators, 49% of their victims were Anglos. Of Latinos, 55% of their victims were Latinos. For Indians, 91% of their victims were other Indians. Latinos, and especially Anglos, were equal opportunity murderers. About half of their victims coming from other ethnic groups. It's important to keep these proportions in mind. The other three neighborhoods on this map, the Vineyard District, Sonora Town, and Downtown, were also quite violent. Unlike Negro Alley and the Plaza, however, in each of them, the majority of perpetrators and victims came from the same ethnic group. First, consider the Vineyard District, and we get a bit of a look at it here in this photograph. So this is, Negro Alley extends here. This is where it intersects with the Plaza. This is known as Plazita, This was a place notorious for cockfighting in the Pueblo. And here's the Vineyard District. Here we've got an orange grove, and then these, mostly this was devoted to grapes, wine grapes. Back here, the river. In the 1850s and 60s, Los Angeles was the biggest wine-producing county in the United States. The vineyards were mostly worked by Indian laborers. The vineyards were also adjacent to the river, across which, on the east side, resided most of the Indian population, in a ghetto known as Pueblito. They had been consigned to the segregated neighborhood during the Mexican period. So the Vineyard District was Indian space. And not surprisingly, most of the victims found there were Indian. Groups of native men and women often drank together in the vineyards after work, later sleeping it off in hidden corners. Newspapers frequently reported on violent incidents that took place, and the bodies of victims were regularly found in the hedgerows, floating in the Zaha Madre, or abandoned along the sandy bottom of the river. In July 1855, for example, the Spanish-language newspaper El Clamor Público reported an altercation between two Indians in the vineyards. One of them pulled a knife and wounded the other. The unhappy victim died in a few moments, and the perpetrator of the horrible crime was placed in jail. On the dawn of the same day, another Indian was killed in the road near the river. He was completely riddled with cuts, and the skull had been broken with stones. And there he stayed, and no one took the job of moving him elsewhere until some poor Indian took him for burial. The area, it seems, is becoming a central station for murderers. 15% of all the murders in the Los Angeles region were committed in the Vineyard District, and the vast majority of those victims were Indian. Among Anglos, Sonora Town, the Latino neighborhood on the Pueblo's north side, had a reputation as an area as equally dangerous as the Vineyard. In this photograph by William Godfrey, looking north up Hill Street, so here we are on Hill Street. If you're familiar with Hill Street today, this is about where the monument to the Mormon Battalion is. Sort of holding up what's left of Fort Moore Hill over here. We'll look north, Sonora Town, the Elysian Hills. This would be Elysian Park today. Here's Chavez Ravine. According to the Los Angeles Star, the north side was a district abounding in the propensities of our Mexican residents for brawling, fighting, and stealing. As one longtime Anglo resident wrote, to cross the plaza and enter this ancient part of Los Angeles is like stepping from an American town into a small pueblo in Guadalajara. So this was Latino space. That was certainly the way it felt to Los Angeles City Marshal Alvison S. Beard. I was sitting at a Monte table in the gambling house of Powers, he testified under oath in 1853, when I was called upon by a Spaniard to go uptown. There was a fellow raising a row up there. I didn't want to go, for I did not like to go so far up that street by myself at night. But up Calle Principal he did go, his revolver drawn and cocked, an episode that ended in the unwarranted and unjustified killing of a Californio by a confused and frightened Anglo lawman. Anglos considered Sonora Town foreign territory and treated the residents accordingly. In January 1857, Anglo vigilantes sealed off the district and conducted an armed house-to-house search for men suspected of connections to the gang that had ambushed and killed Sheriff Jim Barton and his deputies. That was a turning point in Los Angeles history, after which the Latino community was unable to recover its former civic authority. Not surprisingly, virtually everyone murdered in Sonora Town over the period 1850 to 75 was Mexicano or California. As one elderly resident of the North Side told a reporter for the Los Angeles Times at the turn of the 20th century, "Nobody care if Mexicans kill each other. No foreigners ever come into our part of town. If a Mexican kill Americano, there'd be one big row. If they catch him, he hang or get shot. When Americano come into these part of town, the Mexican very seldom kill him, for they know that if one get killed, then the whole street of Mexicans get killed." There was plenty of history to support this man's opinion. Anglos consistently pointed to the dangers of Sonora Town, and indeed, dangerous it was, accounting for 6% of all the murders in greater Los Angeles. But in fact, the downtown area south of the plaza, the commercial district, as well as the residential neighborhoods of Anglo residents, was equally lethal. With nearly the same number of murders as Sonora Town, downtown accounted for another 6% of county homicides. Here's a downtown view during the late 1860s. And if this is not the definition of hard scrabble, I don't know what is. We're looking at the west side of Main Street, just north of Temple, a photograph that showcases the dry goods shop of Solomon Lazard. On a hot summer night in 1871, in the street in front of Lazard's, two deputy city marshals got into a fist fight and had to be separated by bystanders. A few minutes later, one of them had an altercation with a U.S. Marshal who drew his pistol and had to be restrained by a merchant who kept a shop along this same row. When officers engage in street brawls behind the Star, it's time that a remedy should be applied, but violence among those employed to enforce law and order, long a problem in Los Angeles, continued unabated until late in the century. Now we're looking across the street from that very location to the El Palacio, the townhouse of wealthy merchant and ranchero Abel Stearns. In February 1853, Stearns invited a group of prominent Anglos and Californios to a Washington birthday ball at his home. A group of American rowdies at the plaza professed to be deeply offended by this aristocratic way of celebrating the father of their democratic nation. They commandeered an old artillery piece on the plaza, pushed it down to Stearns' place, filled the barrel with stones, loaded it with a small charge, and fired it at the adobe's heavy front doors. Several men came storming out of the house, their revolvers blazing, and two of the protesters were shot and killed. Attorney Jack Watson took full responsibility. He knew the fatal shots had come from his gun, he told the judge at the inquest, because both victims had died of gunshots to the belly. "And it is my habit when I shoot a man at night," Watson explained, "to aim below the belt." The killings were ruled justifiable homicides. Watson was a relative newcomer to Los Angeles, and his public stature was greatly enhanced by this episode. He established a lucrative legal practice, was elected to 3 terms in the state assembly, and married Maria Dolores Dominguez, an heir to Rancho San Pedro. Jack Watson was short in stature, but as an associate put it, he was the gamest man and the best fighter I ever knew. I verily believe he enjoyed fighting for its own sake. A deadlier shot never fingered a revolver. Watson was a devotee of the cult of violence, a sect with many adherents in frontier Los Angeles, both among the rowdies and the aristocrats. It was a sect with its own set of symbols and rituals. Their cross was the Colt revolver. Their creed was stand your ground. Their reward was the glory of defying risk in order to humiliate, wound, or kill an opponent. The shootist, observed Peter Burnett, a Missourian who served as California's first American governor. The shootist was essentially selfish and therefore heeds not the ruin he produces. The cry and distress of the widow and the orphan never reach his dull, cold ear, or affect his stony heart. Burnett's opinion of gunfighters was that most of them are atheists, whose moral conduct depends upon the sliding scale of the times, and who have no strict moral principles independent of public opinion. Watson, in fact, was a lifelong Catholic who got married and witnessed the baptism of his children in the Plaza Church, but he was also a disciple of the cult of violence. Many violent affrays took place along Main Street over the years. One of the most notorious occurred in 1865, the morning after the wedding of Solomon Lazard, the dry goods proprietor whose store we saw, and Carolyn Newmark, daughter of another merchant family, a marriage that united two of the Pueblo's prominent Jewish families. Following the service at the reception, the ballroom of the Bella Union Hotel, just down the street from El Palacio, ranchero Robert Carlyle and Deputy Sheriff Jack King got into a vicious argument. Carlyle pulled a large butcher knife and cut King so badly he nearly bled to death, saved only by the intervention of several doctors present at the reception. When, the following morning, King's two brothers learned of the affray, they went looking for Carlyle. Main Street was all hustle and bustle. Dozens of people had come to town for the wedding, and those who had spent the night at the Bella Union were busy checking out, carrying their bags, loading themselves into coaches and carriages lined up along the dusty street. The King brothers found Carlyle in the hotel bar room, where he had spent the night drinking. They entered, revolvers in hand. "Your time has come," one shouted at Carlyle, who immediately drew his Colt. The three men began firing simultaneously. In a wild exchange that wounded several bystanders and killed a horse hitched to a carriage outside, Carlyle and one of the King brothers died, and the other brother was badly wounded. Tried for murder, he was acquitted. The Pueblo thus accounted for much of the violence in greater Los Angeles, but not all of it. 20% of the murders over the period were committed in the vicinity of the San Gabriel Valley. For the most part, the pattern here is depressingly familiar. People kill each other for all kinds of reasons. For big causes, for petty trifles, or just for the hell of it. But the San Gabriel District also suffered a long history of intense ethnic conflict. In 1771, Franciscans planted a mission where the runoff from the San Gabriel Mountains forces a passage through the Narrows between the Montebello and Puente Hills, a place known today as the Whittier Narrows. In the 19th century, known as El Misión Vieja, the Old Mission. For when the site was inundated by the swollen river a few years later, the missionaries relocated it to the present location in the town of San Gabriel. Missionizing the native people, it's important to note, was inherently violent. Spanish soldiers assisting the missionaries assaulted native villages, raped Indian women, and killed the men who came to their defense. Missionary priests disciplined mission Indians with the lash and sent soldiers after fugitives. Then, during the Mexican period, came the turmoil of secularization. Mission lands were privatized and granted to Californios. Indians were compelled to labor for rancheros and vineyardists. Before the American conquest, most of the murder victims in the San Gabriel District were Indian, and most of the perpetrators were Latino. But that pattern shifted with the coming of the Americans. The penultimate battle of the Mexican-American War in California came at the crossing of the San Gabriel River, just a few miles south of the Narrows, right about here. Virtually every Californio male in the area was present at that battle, which they lost. There's no underestimating the importance of the war and the continuing anger and bitterness on both sides to the foundational history of Southern California. Within a few years, Anglos, many of them from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, began settling former mission grazing lands upon the upper San Gabriel River. The most important settlement was at a place known as the Monte, today's El Monte, with rich soil and plenty of water. When settlement began there, the land had not yet been surveyed by the federal government, and the claims of rancheros were not yet confirmed by the Land Commission created by Congress to assess the legitimacy of Mexican grants and titles. Some settlers purchased land from adjacent rancheros, but most simply asserted their right of preemption on what they declared to be public domain land. The residents of the Monte were nearly all Anglo. The residents of Mission Vieja, nearly all Latino. This is a map from the Huntington collections. It locates the claims of individuals on Ranchero Potrero Grande, which is located just north of the Narrows, or north of the old mission. So here's a close-up, old mission. Here's the grant. You can actually make out the names. I didn't think you would be able to, but you could see they're all Anglo names. Here at Willow Grove, that's the center of the Monte. This is the road connecting down through the Narrows. Today, this is Durfee Avenue. The intrusion of Anglos into this, one of the oldest colonial landscapes in Southern California, was a source of inevitable conflict. In 1854, somewhere along this road, a Monte farmer was found murdered, his body viciously torn apart by knives. Residents of the Monte organized a posse and scoured the countryside. At nearby Rancho La Puente, they seized 2 vaqueros employed by Englishman William Workman and subjected them to harsh interrogation. The vigilantes distrusted Workman, who had supported the Californios during the War of Conquest, and when Workman vouched for his own men, he too was threatened. Eventually, a posse of Californios discovered the actual murderer, hiding in the Puente Hills. Felipe Alvitre was the grandson of one of the soldiers who had come with the missionaries to found Mission San Gabriel, eventually settling at the Narrows, where his descendants remained throughout the 19th century. The farmer had been murdered by the grandson. When the judge asked young Alvitre why he had killed the Monte farmer, he answered plainly, because he was an American. South along the course of the river from the Narrows, nearly all the residents in the 1850s were Latino. The last governor of Mexican California, Pio Pico, had a rancho here, El Ranchito, he called it, in what is now the city of Whittier, located today just off the 605. Here's a photograph of his hacienda, the hacienda at El Ranchito, some years after his death, in a dilapidated condition. It's now a state historical park, well worth a visit. The substantial Latino rural community of Los Nietos was located southeast of El Ranchito. And here we see some of those folks in this photograph, posing with a man who I suspect is Pico, here on the right, next to the children. After the drought and flood of the Civil War years, with the resulting collapse of the livestock grazing economy, rancheros began to sell off their land as dozens of small farmers' plots. And then the Anglo population of the countryside exploded, bringing with it more ethnic conflict. In 1874, at a general store near the Narrows, a young Mexican knifed the proprietor and shot his pregnant wife, who survived but lost the baby. The ensuing manhunt greatly exacerbated ethnic tensions. The night following the attack, a large group of vigilantes from the Monte rode south to El Ranchito, where the attacker had once been employed. Shouting and waving their revolvers, they invaded the bunkhouse and rousted the vaqueros, who responded with angry stares and muttered threats, but the attacker was not there. A constable's posse located him several days later, hiding in a pile of driftwood in the river bottom, less than a mile from the scene of the crime. He attempted to flee, but was brought down by both loads from a double-barreled shotgun. Seriously, probably mortally wounded, he confessed to the crime. The constable put him in the back of a wagon and set out for LA, but after only a mile or two was stopped by a group of men who took the prisoner and hanged him from a nearby oak. Despite the fact that everyone in the neighborhood knew who the lynchers were, a local coroner's jury concluded that the murder had been committed by persons unknown. The outraged Latino community packed an angry public meeting in San Gabriel. Pio Pico, smarting from the invasion of his ranch, cursed the Monte vigilantes and swore that he and his vaqueros would kill the whole damn lot of them. A few days later, an open letter addressed to Pico appeared in a Los Angeles newspaper. If by chance some one of the vigilantes has a bad end by your hand, it read, neither one nor two will pay the debt. As soon as we begin, God alone will see the end. And it was signed, Monte Vigilantes. But violence between Anglos and Latinos was only part of the violence problem along the San Gabriel. Much of the killing that took place in the vicinity of the Monte was among Anglos themselves in conflict over land. Indeed, the King brothers, who engaged in the shootout in the Bella Union Hotel in 1865, first came to public attention 10 years earlier when they engaged in a violent affray with a man disputing their claim to a valuable portion of the Monte, an affray that not only took the life of their competitor, but of their father. A photograph of the El Monte Hotel, located at Willow Grove near the San Gabriel River. Numerous deadly conflicts over land continued. Land is a natural element that no man can live without, a prominent Monte resident declared in a letter to the Los Angeles Star. I have not words to express my contempt of those who will not defend their right to it. The greatest fertilizer that ever was sown broadcast over the land is the blood of those that try to suppress its cultivation. Note the way his statement elevates violence to an end in itself, rather than as simply a means. As I said, a culture of violence. Rancho Potrero Grande, originally granted to a Californio, eventually fell into the hands of a wealthy Anglo ranchero, and in 1875, after his title was confirmed by the courts, he initiated an eviction proceeding against the squatters who defended their claims with firearms, seriously wounding a deputy county sheriff. Squatters remained a persistent source of conflict throughout Southern California. Some of the most persistent and troublesome conflicts over land took place on the far southwestern city limits of Los Angeles, the vicinity of Exposition Park, USC, and the Adams neighborhood. In the early 1860s, the Los Angeles Common Council, in order to generate badly needed revenue, extended the Zanja system to lands owned by the city in the southwest, and then opened them for sale. The area became notorious for disputes over property lines, much as the Monte and Mission Vieja were. To illustrate why this was true, take a look at the Los Angeles city map. Here's a street grid. This is from 1905, but it gives you a clear view. When Spanish authorities laid out Los Angeles in 1781, they did not orient it with the points of the compass, but rather at an angle to the sun's arc in order to provide better light and shade for streets and residents. So here, the corporate limits of the original Pueblo. Outside the corporate limits, however, the cardinal grid of north-south prevailed. Where those two surveys intersected, squished together, there was persistent conflict among owners, often leading to violence. That pattern is very clear in this map. Once I zoom in on you, there's a remarkable bird's eye map of LA from 1894. And here's, let me go back. Here's the area I'm talking about. So here's the line of intersection. We can get a close-up here. So, right, here's what they call agricultural park. So this is the area of Exposition Park. And you can see the way things get all smashed together down here. The southern district of the city, observed the daily news, has been the theater of many deeds of blood. Michel Lacanet and his neighbor Jacob Bell both had farms in this area and both claimed a strip of land running between their respective properties. In December 1870, Bell and his hired man were plowing that strip when Lacanet came up on horseback and began verbally abusing them. The two men retreated to a shed and waited until Lacanet left and then went back to work, but Lacanet returned, this time with a Colt's revolver in his hand. He ordered the hired man to vamoose, which he did, and as that man lumbered over the rough furrows of the plowed ground, he heard a gunshot, and turning, he saw Lacanet firing at Bell, who was struggling with his own pistol, which had jammed. Bell was hit by the fourth or fifth round, and he fell dead. At the inquest, Lacanet contended that Bell fired first, but Bell's gun, found on the ground beside his body, remained fully loaded. Lacanet had a long record of violence, including murder, and within days of the crime, he was forcibly removed from the jail by the Vigilance Committee and became the last in a long list of men lynched in frontier Los Angeles. The last to be lynched, but the first to be photographed. By our own William Godfrey. It's certainly an arresting image. But what is most powerful to me are the boys in the foreground. Notice the men have turned to the camera, but the boys have their eyes on the victim. As I said, the reproduction of violence. Horace Bell, the author of Reminiscences of a Ranger, also had a farm in the southwestern part of the city, and he was frequently in conflict with neighbors over access to water and grass. In 1870, the same year, Lacanet was lynched. Bell found a neighbor's hogs rooting through his cultivated ground, and when the neighbor came to round them up, Bell assaulted him with a horsewhip. 2 years later, Bell's hogs invaded the garden of another neighbor, and Bell went to retrieve them. And when the neighbor complained in a tone that Bell considered insolent, he assaulted the man with the switch he was using to drive his hogs. In both instances, Bell was found guilty in justice court and fined for his offense. These were just two of literally dozens of times that Horace Bell was in court for violent offenses, including 2 indictments for murder, cases that never came to trial, as was true of many of the cases heard by the overtaxed court system of Los Angeles. In many ways, Bell was an admirable character, to me anyway. As a young man, he displayed all the prejudices of his time and place, but as he matured, he grew wiser. In the 1850s, he fought with William Walker in Nicaragua, but he concluded that filibustering was the spirit of conquest run riot, and he volunteered to join the army of Benito Juarez fighting for Mexican liberation. He took a fervent stand against slavery, and during the Civil War, he distinguished himself as a Union scout. Returning to Los Angeles after the war with a wife and children, he became an attorney, most noted for his defense of Latino clients, known throughout Sonora Town as the poor people's lawyer. He published a muckraking newspaper long before that phrase was coined, and he was a constant critic of public corruption and ineptitude. But well into his old age, Bell never lost his enthusiasm for righteous violence. His example reminds us that frontier Los Angeles became the theater of many deeds of blood, not simply because of social forces or evildoers, but because good men like Horace Bell continued to believe in the virtue and the efficacy of personal violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johnny. We will take some time for Q&A. Our experience in this room is that if you shout out your questions, everybody can be heard, but we'll make sure that we repeat the question from the podium if there's any doubt. So the floor is yours.
Yes, sir. Yeah, the question is, can I compare Los Angeles to other areas of the West? And you specifically mentioned San Francisco. Yes and no. We know that the kind of violence I'm talking about was not unique to Los Angeles. However, the kind of detailed study that I've talked about here, the one that I've conducted, have not been done for very few places. San Francisco is one of the places where we have some pretty good ideas. The violence was pretty severe in San Francisco, but not as intense as it was in Los Angeles. And in fact, we hear a lot about the Vigilance Committee in San Francisco, for example, Vigilance Committee of 1851, Vigilance Committee of 1856. Vigilance Committee of 1851 executed 2 individuals. The Vigilance Committee of 1856 executed 4 and exiled several dozen. The various Vigilance Committees of Los Angeles executed more than 50 people. And if these Vigilance Committees are responding to levels of violence, that might give you an idea of the different levels in the different locales. But there's been a debate among historians in the recent past about how violent was the West. And I think we need a lot more detailed studies before we can fully conclude, but I certainly would come down on the side that it was more violent than we think. Yes, it is. Same church. That church basically, 1821, still the same structure, essentially.
Can I take the chair's prerogative and ask you, Johnny, about juries? One of the subtexts of your comments was that jury independence was constrained at best. How are juries put together? Are they subject to subordination or intimidation?
I mentioned several times during the talk about particular individuals who come to trial and then were acquitted. Juries were notorious for acquitting murder, people who were being tried for murder, people accused of murder, indicted for murder. The jury system, it was basically the same system we have today. A call would go out to, they would use the registered voters, and they would issue a call for voir dire and collect jurors and select jurors. Jurors had a bias in favor of defendants, a distinct bias in favor of defendants. That was true about 19th century America in general. One of the, I think, historians of violence, 19th century American violence, have concluded that one one of the underlying structural causes of violence was the unwillingness of juries to convict men accused of violent crimes. In the infamous case, this is probably apocryphal, but it's apocryphal in the sense that it's apocryphal about something that's absolutely true. A man is accused of murder. He says it was self-defense. The prosecuting attorney said, well, but the other man was not armed. He said, but he should have been armed. Yes, the question was, were Latinos, Mexicans, well, Mexicans were, Californios, citizens. Californios were citizens by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And of course, after the 14th Amendment, anyone born in the United States would be a citizen. So if they were on the voting rolls, they would get called as well. In the case I mentioned, Felipe Alverte, the court made a distinct effort to create a balanced jury because the case was so ethnically charged, and so they had a jury of 6 Anglos and 6 Latinos. But I have to say that when you look at the actual record, the number of Latinos serving on juries is very small. And that may be because they didn't appear on the voting rolls as frequently, or that they were challenged off juries. We just don't know because there's actually there are no records of those proceedings. And it's very rare, in fact, that there even exists in the record a list of jurors who served. The Huntington has the Huntington collections contain the court records of Los Angeles County from about the criminal records from about the mid-1850s to the 1870s, and beyond. The Seaver Center has all those earlier than that, and the Pueblo records. Those records get better as time goes on, but even late in the period, it's very rare that a court record, the case file, will include a listing of the jurors. So it's actually hard to know.
I'm going to take one more question. Would you speculate on the reasons for this remarkably high violence? I think you referred to juries unwilling to punish men, and you may have referred to insufficient law enforcement. Were there other reasons? For example, the kind of man who might be drawn to a frontier region?
Yeah. As I said, I've spoken about this before, and the book is all about that. My argument in a nutshell is that I argue that Los Angeles was based on conquest and violence, that conquest, violence, forced labor, those kinds of things were built into the bones of Los Angeles from the beginning. I mean, this is an unusual place that within the lifetime of individuals was conquered twice. The Spanish conquered it, and then the Americans conquered it. So that's built in. And the second part of it is what I call the culture of violence. That is the assumption, and be clear about it, the culture of violence is the assumption that when there's conflict, violence is the appropriate response. All right? I mean, that's, you can learn to manage conflict in a number of ways, but a culture of violence asserts, it was like that quote I read about, the guy saying, if you're not willing to fight for your land, to bleed for your land, to mix your blood with the soil that you own, it's not worth having. So that's a culture which says, if there's conflict, we're going to fight to resolve the issue. That culture of violence was present in Los Angeles. And those two factors, violence baked in, and individuals, both Latino and Anglo, and I'm very careful about this in the book, that the Anglos here mostly came from the South, the Latinos here came from Mexico, and both those cultures were cultures of violence. And those men who came here brought that culture with them. And those two factors, the structure and the culture, ended up reproducing violence. Violence was practiced at home. Children learned it there. They took it into the world. That's why I think that lynching photograph with the children witnessing the lynching is so moving. To me, it's moving, because this is the kind of thing you cannot find a visual evidence for. How do you find visual evidence for the reproduction of violence? There it is. There it is. And it's really quite remarkable. Thank you very much.